Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Pei continues the Gemara's discussion about what happens when part of the tzibor is tamei and part is tahar. There are three main parts to the daf. The first part discusses what happens if the numbers are exactly 50% tamei and 50% tahar, or something close to that. There's a number of different opinions of Tanaim. The Gemara will explain them, and then the Gemara will go through a peculiar statement of Rav, and the Gemara will see how it fits in. Then the Gemara discusses what happens if you have a tamei ziva, and combinations of tamei zav and tamei mace and tamei sheretz. How does that all play out? Then we'll get a Mishnah, and the Mishnah will begin the topic of what happens if there was tumah, and you weren't supposed to bring the carbon, but you did anyway. When does it work b'diavad, and when does it not work b'diavad? So let's briefly remind ourselves what the rules are of a carbon Pesach as far as someone is concerned. The rules are that if an individual or a minority of the congregation is tamei, then they can't bring Pesach Rishon, and they instead bring Pesach Sheni. The Gemara will tell us that that only applies if the majority of the tzibur is bringing Pesach Rishon. If the majority of the tzibur is not bringing Pesach Rishon either for whatever reason, then there's no Pesach Sheni even for the individuals. Now, if a majority is tamei, then the entire congregation is allowed to bring Pesach Rishon b'tumah. As we shall see, even the tahirim are allowed to bring b'tumah, and there is no need for anybody to bring Pesach Sheni, and as a matter of fact, it's not allowed for anybody to bring Pesach Sheni. Now, what type of tumah does this apply to? So it definitely applies to tamei mace. It should also apply to tamei sheretz, but there is an opinion that you can actually bring Pesach Rishon for a tamei sheretz. And it definitely does not apply to a tamei ziva. Tamei ziva is not allowed to bring a Pesach, even if the majority of the tzibor or the entire tzibor is tamei ziva. There is no concept of tum hachar b'tzibor on tamei ziva. The Gemara discusses what happens when it's 50-50, that we've seen a lengthy sugya and daf ayin test. And the Gemara now quotes one of the brises which we saw briefly on daf ayin test, and the Gemara fills out some of the other shittas that are in the brisa, and the Gemara explains how it works. So the brisa says as follows: what happens if the tzibor is 50% tamei and 50% tahar? So we saw, there was one brisa yesterday that says that the halacha is that the tahorin bring b'tahara and the tamein bring b'tumah. The reasoning is that each half use themselves as the rov. 50% counts as a rov. So the tahorim view themselves as the rov, and therefore it's rov tahar, and they have to bring Pesach Rishon. They can't bring b'tumah, they can only bring b'tahara. The Tameim, however, view themselves as Rov, and therefore they can bring Pesach Rishon, because they say we're Rov Tameim, and they can bring it B'tumah, because they say that they're Rov Tameim. Now, that's if it is 50-50. Says the Gemara that if it's one more Tamei than Tahorim, so then everybody brings B'tumah. Even the Taharim are allowed to bring B'tumah, because the halacha is if the majority of the congregation is Tamei, everybody can bring B'tumah. That's the Tanna Kama's opinion when it's one more Tamei than a Tahar. Says the Gemara of Elazar and Masya says that one person cannot sway the congregation. It has to be at least two people more. And he brings the pasuk says Lo sucha lizbayach es pesach be'achad sha'arecha, and he reads it Lo sucha lizbayach es pesach be'echad. You cannot bring your carbon Pesach in a certain way, whether b'tumah or b'tahara, based on one person a majority of one. You have to have at least a majority of two. If it's a majority of one, that counts as 50-50, and it'll be the same halacha as 50-50. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon says as follows: even if you have only one shevet that is tamei, so a shevet counts as a kahal. We see that a shevet is called a kahal, and therefore it counts as if an entire kahal is tamei. That shevet then is allowed to bring b'tumah, because they say, listen, we're tamei, we're considered to be a rov as far as we're concerned, so they're allowed to bring b'tumah. Now the other shvatim say, well, as far as we're concerned, we are a shevet, also it's rov tahorim, so they can only bring b'tahara. So those that are tahorim bring b'tahara, those that are tameim, the shevet that is tamei brings b'tumah. That's Rabbi Shimon's understanding. Says Rabbi Huda, if you have one shevet that's tamei, that's considered like a rov, and not only is it considered like a rov that they're allowed to bring b'tumah, but everybody's allowed to bring b'tumah, because Rabbi Huda says it's a very strong halacha that you do not split the congregation and say part of it is allowed to bring b'tumah, part is allowed to bring b'tahara. We'll get into this more later. He doesn't like splitting. Some have to be b'tahara, some have to be b'tumah, and therefore he says even if you have just one shevet that's tamei, they're allowed to bring b'tumah, everybody's allowed to bring b'tumah. Okay. Now, the Gemara says a statement of Rav. Rav says that if it's 50-50, 50% of the tzibur is tameh and 50% is tameh, you should go be metama one guy. Take one guy, touch him to a sheret, and let him become tameh, and that way you'll have a rove tameim, and everybody will be able to bring betumah. So the Gemara says, why does Rav want you to do this? We already know what Rav holds when it's 50-50. Rav says that the tameim are allowed to bring betumah, and the taharim are allowed to bring betahar, because each one counts as a rove. Each one views themselves as the majority. So the Gemara says, we're talking about a situation where it's one more person tameh than a tahar. The Gemara says, one more person tameh than tahar. So why do you have to be metame anybody? It's rove tameim. So then let everybody bring Tama, what's the point of being metami one? So the Gemara says, no, we want to go like Rav Elazar ben Masya, and one person tame is not enough. You need to have at least two people tame, and that's why we say be metama somebody else, and that way you'll have a rove of two. The Gemara says, 1 second, if you're going like Rav Elazar ben Masya, so that when one person is tame counts as 50-50. So we're back to our first question, 50-50. We already know what Rav holds. Why do you have to go add somebody and make it a rove? 50-50 is enough. The Gemara says, okay, I'll give you a different explanation. Rav was trying to fit in the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda together with the opinion of the Tanna Kama. The Gemara now is understanding when Rabbi Yehuda says that we don't split the tzibur, and if some of them are allowed to do betumah, they're all allowed to do betumah. Rabbi Yehuda is saying they have to do betumah. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not correct. It's not covered at tzibur to have part of them bringing a carbon betumah, and the other part says, oh, stay away from me. I don't want to become tummy from you. We have to separate. That's not covered. And therefore, if part of the people bring the tumah, everybody has to bring betumah. The problem starts with what happens when you have 50-50. If it's 50-50, according to the opinion of the Tanna Kama, which the Gemara now wants to fit into Rav Yehuda, and it's 50-50, each one views themselves as a majority. So the Tahorim will say, we can't bring Betumah because we're majority Tahar, and when it's a majority Tahar, nobody's allowed to bring Betumah at all. Now the Tameim view themselves as the Tamei fine. They say that they're the majority, they can bring Betumah, but the Tahorim view themselves as majority, and therefore they can't bring Betumah. So what are you supposed to do? So you got to get it off the 50-50. So the Gemara says, Rav says, to be matami somebody with a sheretz. That way it's majority tameim, and everybody's allowed to bring betuma. You don't have a problem of splitting it. The Gemara says there's other solutions here to this situation. Ula said, you take one person, you send him away. The halach is somebody that's b'derech rechoka is not chayav in a carbon pesach. You send him away, and that way he's not included in the count. You send away one of the tahorim, and that way you have a majority tameim, and therefore everybody could bring betuma, not a problem. So the Gemara says, why does Ula say that? Why doesn't he just go with the simple solution of being metame him with his sheretz? The Gemara says, well, because Ula doesn't hold to that. Ula holds that a person who's tamei sheretz is allowed to bring a carbon pesach. Why? Because he can go to the mikveh today, and by nighttime he'll be able to eat it. So even though he's tamei sheretz while you're bringing the carbon, that's all right, because by the time for eating it comes, he'll be okay. So therefore, tumas sheretz is not called tuma at all. Being matam with the sheretz would not solve the problem. So Gemara says, so be matam tumas mace, and that way he'll be real tamei, and you don't have an issue. Gemara says, matam tumas mace, there's a different problem. You're not allowing him to bring his carbon chagiga. You're blocking him from being able to bring his chagiga. So Gemara says, very funny. You're blocking him from bringing a chagiga. How's your solution any better than that? You're sending him away. He's not going to be able to bring his carbon pesach. He'll come back in time to bring the carbon chagiga. You could bring that all 7 days, but you're not allowed. You're creating a situation in which he can bring a carbon pesach at all. How are you any better than us who are not allowing him to bring a carbon chagiga? So the Gemara says, what's the problem? He'll bring the carbon pesach by Pesach Sheni. You're blocking him from bringing chagiga altogether. The Gemara says, no, I'm not. You can bring a carbon chagiga the rest of Yom Tov. Chagiga could be brought all 7 days of Yom Tov. You could be matamim to mace a few days before Yom Tov, and that way he'll be tar by the end of Pesach. He can bring it then. Gemara says, no, Ula holds that you can only bring a carbon Pesach the other days of Yom Tov if you could have brought it the first day and you didn't for whatever reason. The halacha is that the other days are tashlumin. You can fill in for a carbon you could have brought the first day and you didn't. But if you can't bring it the first day, you can't bring a carbon chagiga the rest of the days, and therefore it wouldn't help, and therefore we don't want to be matam tamas meis because he'll lose the chagiga. Instead, we send him away and tell him, come back later, bring your chagiga the rest of Pesach, and bring a carbon Pesach on Pesach Sheni. Now the Gemara says that Rav Nachman had a comment on this, and he said, Ula, you think you're going to get people to leave town, why do you think you're going to be able to tell somebody, uproot your tent and go run away. Who says anybody will be willing to do that? Nobody's going to be willing to do that. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's discussion about what happens when it's half and half with Tmei. And now the Gemara introduces Zavin. Now the halacha, as we said in our introduction, is that a Zav does not have an option to bring Bid Tzibor. If you have a Tzibor that's a Rov Tumah Zav, there is no Carbon Pesach Bid Tzibor on Zavin. It only applies to Tamei Mace and Tamei Sheretz, according to those that say that Tamei Sheretz aren't considered Tahorim and just bring it normally. So now the Gemara discusses a few cases of what happens when you have Zavin. So the first case is where you have a majority of the tzibur are zavin, and a minority of them are tmei mesim. So the Gemara says the halacha is that the tmei mesim can't bring not Pesach Rishon and not Pesach Sheni. Why? They can't bring Pesach Rishon because they're a minority tmei mesim. We know that if it's a minority tmei mesim, you can't do Pesach Rishon. You don't say Tumah Hutra B'tzibor. You can't do Pesach Rishon. Now, as far as doing Pesach Sheni, you can't do that either. Because here we have the halacha. You can only do Pesach Sheni if Pesach Rishon is being brought. If a majority of the tzibur is bringing Pesach Rishon, and you can't, so you get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But here, there's nobody doing Pesach Rishon. Some people are Zavim, some people are Tmei Meis. Therefore, the Tmei Meisim cannot do Pesach Sheni. They don't get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Now, some Rishonim also point out that the Zavim can't do Pesach Sheni either, for the same reason, and they explain why the Gemara focuses only on the Tmei Meisim and not on the Zavim. Okay. Now, the Gemara says that this was a statement of Rav, and Shmuel complained about this. Shmuel wasn't happy, because Shmuel said it comes out that nobody's doing a Korban Pesach at all. How could they have a situation where nobody's doing it? The pasuk says, "Yazib b'nei Solas Pesach b'mayadai." You have to. The tzibur is supposed to be able to do it. Shmuel therefore says we should not look at the Zavim at all. We should exclude them. We should look at everybody else and say that it's majority Tmei Mesim. So then let everybody bring Pesach Rishon. They should be the entire tzibur should be only those that are not Zavim. Gemara says, Rav said, what are you talking about? It's very possible that the entire tzibur cannot bring. That's the law of Zavim. Zavim don't have Tumah Hutru B'tzibur, and then what would you do if everybody was a Zav? So then nobody would be able to bring. So here also nobody would be able to bring. What are you supposed to do? It's not a problem. The Gemara now brings its next case, which is what happens when you have the majority of the tzibur is Tmei Meis, and therefore Tumah Hutra, they're allowed to bring their carbon Pesach on Pesach Rishon B'tumah, but you have a minority that's Tamei Zavin, so they can't bring. There's no Tumah Hutra on Zavin. The question is, can they bring Pesach Sheni? So this is a machlokes. Rav Huna says, no, they cannot bring. There is no Pesach Sheni if Pesach Rishon was done B'tumah. Pesach Sheni is only if Pesach Rishon was done B'tahara, and you couldn't be a part of it. But if Pesach Sheni was done B'tumah, and you couldn't be a part of it because you were a Zav, then even if you're Tahar in Pesach Sheni, you can't bring. Pesach Sheni is only Pesach Rishon was done B'tahara. The Gemara says, no, Rav Adbar Ava disagrees, and he says, why? Pesach Sheni is for people who couldn't do Pesach Rishon. Pesach Rishon was B'tumah, and there's still some people who couldn't do it. They can make it up for Pesach Sheni. So Gemara says, what's this machlokes about? So Gemara first wants to say, maybe the machlokes is, do we say Tumah Hutra or Tumah D'chuya? When we say that the tzibur could do a Pesach, does that mean that the entire Tumah is gone? It's like it doesn't exist, and therefore it's as good as if it was done B'tahara, and somebody who couldn't qualify, therefore, is allowed to do the Pesach Sheni, like if he was a Zav? Or do we say, no, it's Tumah D'chuya, we allow you to do it, but the Tumah is still there, and therefore the rule that there is no Pesach Sheni when there was Tumah and Pesach Rishon, that still applies. So says that's not necessarily machlokes. Machlokes could just be in a case where you have the majority that's Tmeim, can you do a Pesach Sheni or not? It doesn't have to be because of Tumah Hutra, Tumah D'chuya, you don't have to get into that. Could just be, is a Tamei Pesach Rishon, does that allow for a Pesach Sheni, or that does not allow for Pesach Sheni at all? Okay, now, the Gemara's next case is what happens if the Klal Yisrael is divided into thirds. 1/3 is Tamei Meis, 1/3 is Tahar, 1/3 is Tamei Zavim. So Gemara says, the halacha is, those Tamei Meisim can't do not Pesach Rishon and not Pesach Sheni. Why? So Gemara says as follows. Pesach Rishon they can't do because there's only a minority of the people that are Tamei Meis. The majority are not. The majority, therefore the majority people, we don't have a majority of Tumah Hutra B'tzibor people. The majority are either Tahar or Tumas Ziva, where there is no Tumah Hutra B'tzibor that applies to them. Therefore they can't do Pesach Rishon. Now they can't do Pesach Sheni either because Pesach Sheni only works when a minority of the tzibur is coming to do Pesach Sheni. But here you have Tameim of the Zavim and the Mesim together couldn't do Pesach Rishon, so they're coming together to do Pesach Sheni. You didn't have a majority doing Karban Pesach Rishon and a couple of people want to do Pesach Sheni. You can only do Pesach Sheni if the majority of people did Pesach Rishon and you missed it. Here, the majority of people couldn't do Pesach Rishon, and therefore there is no Pesach Sheni either, and the Tmei Mesim cannot do Pesach Sheni. Okay, this ends the Gemara's discussion. The Gemara now goes to what our next Mishnah, and the Mishnah discusses what happens if the Karban Pesach was brought, and then you found out that there was Tumah involved, and it should be Tamei. So the Mishnah says as follows. If you have a Pesach Sheni, if you have a Pesach, a Karban Pesach that was brought, and its blood was put on the Mizbech, and then you found out that something was Tamei. Either the blood was Tamei, or the meat was Tamei. As we know, a Karban Pesach is puzzle if the meat is Tamei. It has to be eaten, and if it's not edible because it's all Tamei, the Pesach is puzzle. Well, here you found out after you put the blood on the Mizbeach that something was messed up. Either the blood was tummy or the meat was tummy. So the Mishnah says, Allah is a tzitz meratza. Tzitz meratza, the tzitz takes off the tumah, just like tzitz always does, and therefore the carbon is kosher b'diavad. Now, the Gemara says that all applies if something happened to the meat or to the blood. What if something happened to the person, the people who are supposed to be eating it? So there, the halacha is that tzitz doesn't help. Tzitz only helps for the carbon. Tzitz doesn't help for the person. And if there's no person who could eat it, the carbon's puzzle. The Gemara says the same thing applies by a nazir. A nazir, the halacha is that he has to be a nazir to bring his carbon of ending his naziros. If he becomes tamei, his naziros is spoiled, and therefore he's not a nazir anymore, and his carbon becomes puzzle on the spot. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says, this is all true about Tumah Vadai. If you have a case of Tumah Safek, so on that, the tzitz works. Even on a carbon Pesach and a carbon Nazir, we have a Safek Tumah. On the person who's bringing it, who it's being brought for, the tzitz will take off Safek Tumah, that it is able to do. Okay, the Gemara now begins. The Gemara says the language of the Mishnah seems to be very clear that it's only if you put the blood on the Mizbech and you didn't know that there was Tumah there. You found out afterwards that it was Tameh, either the blood or the meat or the person. Well, the blood and the meat, it would be kosher b'diavad, and the person would be Tameh b'diavad. But we're only discussing where you found out later that it was there. What would be if you knew that it was Tameh and you put the blood on the Mizbech anyway? Does the tzitz work for that or not? So the Gemara says the implication of the Mishnah seems to be that the tzitz does not work. I have a problem with that because I have a Mishnah that says that it does work. The Gemara quotes this brisa. The brisa says that the tzitz works to take off tumah and make the carbon kosher, whether it's on the blood or it's on the meat or it's on the chelev. And now it says the following thing: bein b'shoigi bein b'mizid, whether it's on purpose or by accident; bein b'inus bein b'ratzon, whether you were forced or you did it willfully; bein b'yachid bein b'tzibur, whether it's a public carbon or an individual's carbon. So you see clearly, bein b'shoigi bein b'mizid, whether you did it on purpose or by accident. The Gemara assumed that means on purpose means you knew that it was tamei and you did it anyway. So Gemara says it's not what bein b'shagi bein b'mezid means. Gemara says bein b'shagi bein b'mezid means whether it became tamei on purpose or it became tamei by accident. But the only way in which it is mutter is if you put it on the mizbeach by accident. You put it on the mizbeach on purpose, that's no good, just like a Mishnah says. Now the Gemara says a different explanation. The Gemara says Rav Sheila understands this brisa differently. He says no. When we say whether b'shagi or b'mezid, it's talking about the putting on the mizbeach. If you put it on the mizbeach, whether b'shagi or b'mezid, the tzitz works and it's meratzeh. But it's only meratzeh when it says. But it's only meratzeh if the tumah became on it b'shagi. If you were matami it on purpose, then the tzitz is not meratzeh. Tzitz doesn't help if you're matami or carbon on purpose. So the Gemara says, then how are you going to explain our Mishnah? Our Mishnah seemed to indicate that if you knew it was tummy when you put it on the mizbeach, the tzitz doesn't help, and you're telling me that it does help. So the Gemara says, we'll correct the implication from our Mishnah. The Mishnah agrees that if you put the blood on the mizbeach when you knew it was tummy, the tzitz works anyway. Why did it say in a case where you didn't know? The Gemara says because I wanted to teach you that if there was tumas haguf, the tzitz does not work. That's even if you didn't know. That's why we chose the case of didn't know, to teach you that even then it's no good. But on the side, on the halachas where we're saying that the tzitz does work if the blood is tummy or if the meat is tummy. That's even if you did know, it's lav dafka that case. Okay, the Gemara now refers back to the last part of the Mishnah. The last part of the Mishnah had said that both by a carbon Pesach and by a Nazir, if there's a suffix tumah, the tzitz does help. Normally, if the person's tameh by these two karbanos, the tzitz doesn't help. But if it's suffix tumah, it does help. Now the Gemara says, if you say suffix tumah, the tzitz helps. That's suffix tumah on the person's being brought for, or even suffix tumah on the kayin. We know that kahanim also are metame a carbon and spoil it. If there's a suffix tumah on the person of the kayin, does the tzitz help for that as well, or it's only said on the owner? So the Gemara says, I'll bring you a proof. And the Gemara brings a fascinating proof from a brisa, which says that this concept of the tzitz helping for suffix tumah is only said by a tamei mace. So the Gemara says, okay, it's only said by a tamei mace. What is it not by? It must mean that it's not by a tumas sheretz. The Gemara says, okay, let's figure out what is the case of this tumas sheretz that the the suffix tumah, the tumas sheretz, that the tzitz doesn't help for. Now, if you want to tell me that it's referring to when the owner was tummy tumas sheretz, what carbon are you talking about? A nazir doesn't have tumah of a tumas sheretz. It doesn't spoil the carbon of a nazir. A nazir is allowed to become tumas sheretz. He's just not allowed to become tumas mace. Tumas mace spoils his naziris. Tumas sheretz doesn't. So you want to say we're talking about a carbon Pesach? Well, we saw just before there's a machlokes whether a person who's tummy tumas sheretz is allowed to have a carbon Pesach brought for him or not. So according to the opinion that he is allowed to fine, but that he's not allowed to fine. Now I understand why you need the tzitz, but according to the other opinion that because the person who has tumas sheretz becomes tahar at night when the sun goes down and he's allowed to eat the carbon, therefore you're allowed to bring it for him in the first place, so this Mishnah wouldn't make any sense. How would he understand it? So we can't be talking about where the owner becomes tummy tumas sheretz. It must be, what are we talking about? Talking about where the kohen becomes tummy tumas sheretz. That can't be helped. And you clearly see that this Mishnah is saying that it doesn't work because it's tumas sheretz. But it will be other types of tumah, then it generally would apply to the kayin. And therefore you know that the tzitz is maratza, the tzitz helps to take off tumah even for the kayin, not only for the owner. So when it says, I'll knock this entire proof down by telling you we're not talking about tumah sheretz altogether. When we say that the tzitz only works for tamei mace and not other tumahs, we're telling you that it doesn't work for tumah ziva. Tumah ziva is a tumah that does apply to the nazir. That does apply to the carbon Pesach. So if somebody's a suffix tumas ziva, the tzitz does not take that off. That's what this is teaching me. But it's talking about the owner. It's not talking about the kohen, because there is no circumstance in which the tzitz helps for the kohen himself. Now Rashi explains what's the situation of suffix tumas ziva. That's somebody who's in his last day of zoif. If he manages to finish the day clean, he brings a carbon, then he can eat the carbon Pesach tonight after the sun goes down. However, we don't know yet if he's going to be able to do that, because he may see another ziva today, and that'll mess up his entire tahar and he'll have to start over. Therefore, he's called Tumah Ziva B'Safek, and if it turns out that he becomes Tameh, the tzitz
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.